Hey, what is up, guys? It's Nathan with Park Life. I've been wanting to do this video for a while. I have a lot of people message me on Facebook as well as a couple other platforms I'm on asking what are the basics to the turbo kit. Today we're going to give you all you need to know about what it actually mechanically takes to turbo your car, what the parts are required. So stay tuned. Alright guys, we're in the process of turboing our SC300, and I have a bunch of random parts. You don't need all of this to turbo your car, but the basic parts we're going to go over, and I'm going to explain some differences between types of exhaust housings on turbos, internal versus external wastegate, the purpose of a blow-off valve, and basically just overall how the system works. A lot of people give people a hard time for not knowing all of this. We all start somewhere, and that's kind of where I'm at with this video. As my channel grows, I want you guys to grow with it and kind of get the same perspective. For some of you guys, this is redundant and something you already know and you don't care, or maybe you don't care at all. Maybe you don't want to learn this. But that's what this is about. This is about getting everybody on the same basic page as far as what is a turbo system, how does it work, and everything you need to know. So, first of all, we have to figure out kind of where our motor sits. So that's going to be research on your end. So figuring out, what kind of boost levels and what kind of power levels a motor can take safely, what the fuel system can handle. And so that's one big determining factor, because a lot of people, you could slap a turbo on anything and it might run for a few miles. But the key is to figure out what your motor's capable of and the health and condition of your exact motor. That's the other important factor. So like for instance, our SC300 has 280,000 miles, but I've done a compression test on it and it comes back awesome. There's very little variance between cylinders. There's no way to argue that with the mileage it has bearing wear over time. That's just a natural process that happens. But I feel like the motor's strong enough to take some boost, and I think it's going to hold it for a while. So determining how much power your motor is capable of, what the fueling looks like, how much of a margin you have, what type of sensors your motor uses. We're not going to get into all that today. We're going to mostly just cover, and this is a series I want to continue doing, and we'll get into that over the course of the series. But in this series, we want to get into what does it physically take to turbo your car? What is it going to take you to physically bolt a turbo on? Fueling, all that's something we'll discuss at a later time. But the basic mechanical parts to your turbo kit are going to be your manifold, your turbo, your exhaust, and then your charge pipes that connect the cold air from the turbo to your intake manifold. And then let's also take a second, let's take 2 seconds here, and just for those that don't know, what actually makes a turbo work? How does it work? What does it do? So basically, when your normal engine, you have air go in your intake, combustion happens, goes out your exhaust header, and down and out your exhaust. So what a turbo does is it collects that off your motor, these ports here, it collects the exhaust, puts it in here, shoves it into your turbo on the hot side. So this is referred to as the hot side. So it goes in that hole, spins up the impeller in here as it exits, spins that, which spins a shaft connected to this, which is the intake side of your turbo, sucks air in, spits it out. This goes to your intake manifold. So sometimes through an intercooler, what have you. But that's the basic concept. You're taking the wasted exhaust gases that normally just go out your exhaust pipe, and you're spinning up this impeller, which spins the cold side, sucks fresh air in, shoots fresh air into your motor. A lot of people have a misconception about that, but that's exactly how that works. So what we have to talk about now is the manifold. So when you're buying a turbo kit, the first part you want to look at is your manifold. There's a few different styles. We don't need to get into a ton of detail here because that's going to determine later on, once you're actually in the process of picking your power levels, all of that. Are you going built motor or stock motor? But basically, you have a log manifold or a tubular manifold. The next factor, so the second factor, is your turbo going to be internally wastegated or externally? And what that means is, so remember that hot exhaust gas is coming out of this pipe, right? Spooling up that turbo. Well, you can only put so much boost into a motor. So you have to be able to regulate how much exhaust gas goes through this turbo. So once you hit a set number, you have to have a way to bypass the turbo. So there's internally wastegated. I don't have one on here, but I'll put a picture up for you guys to see what I'm talking about. Basically, internally wastegated, there would be a port on the side of this right here. And basically, instead of going through this impeller and spinning it up, it's going to spit the exhaust gas around this impeller and straight out to your exhaust system, thus not spitting up the turbo anymore. So when the wastegate opens, the exhaust gases are not going through your turbo. They're going around the turbo. On an externally wastegated, same idea, except for your manifold takes care of it. So it's external. So this wastegate sits right off to the side. So exhaust will always go with the least path of resistance. So if it has to go through this and through that impeller spinning it, that's work. This is less work to go through this pipe and out. So it'll bypass your turbo. So in other words, this, as soon as you hit your, whatever your desired boost, this guy cracks open, spits the exhaust out, and then you're no longer going into boost. Like your boost is regulated by this guy. So that's the difference between internal, so inside the turbo, or external, where it's vented on your actual manifold. So this is an external setup, as are most 2JZ turbo applications. There are some manifolds, a few log manifolds that use internal, but for the vast majority of like 2Js, so the SC300, the Super, all those, it's external. And that's what we're doing here. So manifold, you have to determine whether you are getting what log or tubular style, internal versus external, because you'll have to match whatever your turbo is. If your turbo is not set up for external wastegate, then you need a external wastegate manifold with an external wastegate. If not, a lot of like the cheaper eBay kits on like your Hondas and Acuras and Mazdas and that sort of thing, they'll utilize a internally wastegated turbo. So all you won't have this, you'll just have this flange. Your turbo is where the wastegate is. That's the vast majority of the lower end eBay turbos, that sort of thing. It's internal wastegated, not external. And it does simplify things because your turbo takes care of it. You don't have additional wastegate plumbing, that sort of thing. So that's the things you want to watch for. The other thing, if you're buying your manifold separate from your turbo, so you're buying two separate pieces. You're buying your manifold first, you're buying your turbo next. You have to figure out what footprint the turbo uses. So again, with the JZ platform, 99.9%, there are some log manifolds that are T3, but they use a T4. And that's why I have these two guys up here. So this is a T3 hot side. So this is a T3 size. This is a T4. As you can see, the T3 is much smaller, which for like a 4-cylinder or small V6s, this is better. There's also divided versus undivided. So both of these exhaust manifold or exhaust housings on these turbos is divided. So there's a separation. If you look at this guy, it is wide open. What this does for you is it increases the exhaust gas velocity. So in other words, if you have a divided manifold, so this manifold's not divided, it's also wide open. If it's divided, this is divided, you have separate exhaust pulses, that increases your velocity, thus increasing your spool up time. There are advantages and disadvantages. For instance, on a open design, peak horsepower typically is higher, whereas your torque is made down lower because the turbo is spooling up faster with the divided housing. So it's entirely up to you with what you want to go with. A lot of the T3 turbos are going to have a divided housing. Not all, but a lot. So basically, pick your manifold, figure out whether it's a T3, T4. There's also V-band and all kinds of craziness. Like this wastegate's a V-band. So it uses a clamp between the two versus a bolt-on. I love V-band. But just make sure you're matching your turbo mating surface to what your turbo manifold has. Make sure they're the same. And then make sure internal versus external wastegate. That's the biggest thing. And then, so now we have our turbo bolted to our motor. We have the manifold, the turbo bolted together. How do we get rid of those exhaust gases? Well, off the back of the turbo, you'll have a downpipe. Again, this is a V-band. You put that on there, click it on, and that's car specific. So this is going to also be a car specific piece, your downpipe. So a lot of the times when you're ordering a turbo kit, like an eBay generic or like a CX Racing or one of the other brands, they will come with a downpipe. Sometimes you have to actually get something welded on your exhaust, or sometimes you'll have to order what's called a mid pipe. So that's the pipe that goes between your exhaust and your downpipe. Sometimes it'll bolt into factory. A lot of the times these pipes, though, are 3-inch. And so your factory exhaust, you're going to have an exhaust shop weld a flange in there or something. Also, you can get the mid pipe, which will connect it to your cap or your muffler back exhaust. But that's the basic parts on that. So, and then if you have external wastegate, you also have to figure out where you want to send this. If you want to recirculate it back into your exhaust system, or if you want to bypass your exhaust system, that's up to you. That's a topic for another day. If it's internally wastegated, though, it's all taken care of with your downpipe. So next, you need to plumb your air from the exit on your turbo to your intake manifold. Depending on your boost pressure, engine positioning, you need to determine whether you need to get a intercooler or not. For a lot of lower boost, small boost applications, intercooler is not required. You're not creating and generating enough heat for it to be that beneficial. If you're starting to get into higher powers, whatever, I definitely recommend an intercooler. And honestly, they're so inexpensive. Why not? Because it'll give you some future proofing with it. Also, one thing to talk about, and this is a debated topic to some degree, is when you're running your intercooler pipe, you need something to protect your turbo. It's called a blow-off valve. That's the sound we all know and love. Choo! You know, it's awesome. Choo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Anyway, the idea is you have this spinning up to 40,000 RPMs, the impeller on this. You have all those hot exhaust gases. You're shifting. Or you come to a stoplight. You close that butterfly valve on your intake. All that air is cramming in there. This guy's still spinning at 40,000 RPMs. And you're expecting all that air to stop, and then it causes turbulence, and it builds up pressure, and eventually it blows back through the turbo. So it goes backwards through the turbo, stops the impeller, and causes the impeller to have to let all the air flow out, the intake, which is devastating for a turbo, especially on higher boost applications. On low boost applications, people get away with it, but you'll get, in and out shaft play. You'll get all kinds of walk in your impeller. It'll chip the blades, all kinds of problems. And people will comment on this 20 million miles and no issues. Other people will say I made it no miles and blew up my turbo and ruined my motor. I've seen it damage. I've not seen catastrophic failure, but I've seen several where you have low mileage turbos where the shaft has made contact or the impeller's made contact with the sides of the housing. That is no good. That is no fun. Nobody enjoys that. It ruins turbos. Not good. So I recommend running a blow-off valve. I believe the best bang for the buck, in my opinion, and the best performing blow-off valve for the price, correct me if I'm wrong or show me better solution, but the HKS sequential is amazing. This guy, the Gretty Type R, is what I'm going to be running on the Supra. And half of that is vanity. Right now it has a Blitz blow-off valve. I've had everything from the Gretty RS, whatever, Type S, all of them. I've had a HKS sequential, which is what a lot of people run on their Supra. It's very redundant. The MR2 here is running the HKS sequential, and I think it's great. It's a great blow-off valve, super responsive. This guy, I just think it's hilarious sounding, and it's completely ricey to pick it, but it makes a doo-doo sound. So I absolutely love it. This is what I'm running on the Supra going forward. So that's that, and that is the basic mechanical portions. The only thing I'd really like to talk about in this particular little segment is oiling. So there are different ways to do that, and a lot of the turbo kits you're ordering will come with an oiling kit. You need a oil feed. And so you need a source on your block to get oil to your turbo. Most all turbos are aftermarket turbos, not all. A vast majority are only oil cooled, not water cooled. So when you're oil cooling, you need a feed. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you're running a ball bearing turbo, a lot of the times they'll have restrictors, and the turbo will tell you if it needs restrictors in it. If it needs restrictors, then you need to run them because otherwise you'll blow out your oil seals. But it usually will come with a pill-style little thing you put in there and block off some oil pressure. So there's different ways for each motor to get your oil source. The only way, like on the Supra, I use on the back of by the oil union, there's a union bolt in there. I back it out, I tap it, and that's how I get my oil source for all my 2JZ stuff. You can also use on any car an oil sandwich plate adapter. It just literally goes between your oil filter and the block. You put your oil filter on, and you have two little feed ports, usually one for oil pressure, one for your oil feed for your turbo. And that's the oil feed isn't a big deal as long as you're making sure that you're getting your restrictor if it requires one for the turbo. Almost all ball bearing turbos do. Make sure you get that. The biggest issue, and this is where 90% of the turbo kits go wrong, this is an oil return. So people will put this on there, and then they'll get like a 1/4 inch little tiny pipe, and they'll have it do stuff like this or what have you. And any kink like that, what happens is your oil gets in there, builds up pressure, blows back into your turbo. This keeps feeding. The oil has nowhere to go except for out the intake or out the exhaust, ruining your seals. And it just ruins the turbo in no time flat. Then you end up with oiling issues on the actual journals, and you're also sitting there with hot oil just baking those bearings. The journal bearings, yeah, they're a little more forgiving. Ball bearings use almost no oil, but they want that constant light flow of oil, just a little bit of oil. And it needs to be consistent and not ridiculous. So for oil return, you want something, usually typically at least a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and you want it to be nice and straight. So this one sits like this. So right off the bottom of the turbo, right in the side of the block. And that's the other thing. When you're tapping for your oil return, do not tap it at oil level. In other words, it needs to be open air. If you're tapping it and you're at oil level, and this is trying to return oil and you're trying to gravity feed through a puddle of already oil, it's not going to return well. It's going to start backing up. Same problem, doesn't matter how straight the line is. This is probably the number one thing I see that ruins turbos. Like people are like, oh, my turbo only made it 2 miles. Yeah, because you didn't do it right. But that's okay. We're all learning here. We're trying to get you guys to avoid those pitfalls. But that is the basic components to bolt a turbo onto any car. There's a lot of different things that factor in fueling, air-fuel ratios, and also determining what your rods and pistons can take. We're fortunate with the 2JZ. It takes a lot of abuse and keeps coming back. But we need to determine what works for your particular car. And the only way to do that is through research. So start researching each car, each motor, and then each specific situation is different. I mean, some people will have a car that's got 50,000 miles, but their compression's terrible. Across all the cylinders, it varies a huge amount. Or you have really noisy valves and really noisy valve train, which means your motor wasn't taken care of. Probably not the best boost candidate. But like I said, our SC has a bajillion miles. We're turboing it. And the other thing I did was I limited myself to $1,000 for the entire turbo kit, including fuel pump, fuel system, turbo manifold, turbo wastegate, blow-off valve, intercooler, the whole thing. And that's about seeking deals. I wanted to find a way to do it in a way that you guys could copy it and see the same results. You don't have to have the newest, greatest, best parts to turbo your car. I'm curious to see how this turns out and how long it lasts. I mean, we're talking, I'll be $1,600 into this SC and have bought it NA, turboed it, and everything else. We'll see where it ends up. If it blows up, it blows up. But honestly, I don't think it will. I think we'll get a lot of miles out of it and a good time. Anyways, that is your basic parts. I'm going to continue doing more on this series, especially as we're turboing that C300. But I just want to catch everybody up to speed. There's nothing wrong with not knowing stuff. Nothing at all. It's when you spread misinformation that there's a problem. So learning, always being willing to listen. And that old guy that has nothing to do with import cars or whatever, listen to them, because a lot of the time they know what the heck they're talking about. All the technology we got was from people that had done it before. I mean, if you talk to old-time airplane mechanics, they'll tell you all about water injection and meth injection and nitrous and all this other stuff. Super cool stuff, all from like the 50s, or 40s, even 30s. But super cool technology, a lot out there. Keep your ears open and your mouth shut more often than not, you'll learn something. Anyways, thanks guys for watching. I really appreciate it. And we'll be doing a lot more updates on the SC300. Obviously, we got the MR2 rolling. We're trying out some new wheels here. But yeah, guys, if this was helpful for you, please like and subscribe, share it with your friends. And most of all, stay tuned, guys.